Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here with us today. I would like to ask the rector of the university to come to the floor for a small presentation, a short presentation. Mr. Petrakis, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, the presence of all the friends and colleagues interested in today's event shows how topical this is, and Mr. Petrakis and the organization of this event have an important, crucial role right now. The subject is very important. It's conditions for growth for Greek economy. We live now this difficult path, and the way to come back to a sustainable growth is what we all request. In order to take the direction of growth, we need to understand the evolution of the crisis and the phase where we are right now. So we need to evaluate, we need to review when the end of the memoranda is going to be and what will come next. The end of the memoranda seems to be quite far off. However, there are some positive developments recently. Such a debate must take into consideration the deviating paths of growth. And what is also important is the processes of European integration. We need to find the role of Greece in this framework. All the demands from an integrated growth of the Greek economy are very high, and we will need to talk a lot about that. Such a debate will follow today. This debate will be called upon to answer important issues that preoccupy the Greek economy, and everybody has to see how Greece is going to go away from this captivity. It's in the honor of our establishment to welcome everybody, all the guests here, whom their knowledge will try to provide answers to these questions or to some of the questions that concern us. Answers to these questions will also be answers to all those who trace or will contribute to trace the financial policy of Greece and who give us the international light, the international viewpoint of our economy. On behalf of the administration of the university, I would like to thank you for your presence. I would like to thank most of all our dear guests. And I cannot end these greetings without congratulating my dear colleague, Professor Petrakis, for his initiative for one more very successful event. Thank you.
Κύριε Πρίτανη, κύριε αγαπητές συναδέλφες και συνάδελφοι, αγαπητές φίλες και φίλοι.
Dear guests, we would like to thank you all for being here today. The university is there in order to serve sciences and society in a way to improve the prosperity of people. Economics as a social science have this mission. Science and economists are driven by the needs of society through policies and communication. Science has a universal character. Somewhere good ideas are born and they're submitted in the torture of criticism on a global scale. This was always the case, even in the centuries where technology would not facilitate that. Even more today, Greek economy lives in a lost decade of recession. Some of those years were really torturing. Now, supported by the constant and big sacrifices of the Greek people, we do hope to do better in the future. To do that, we have to speak with important scientific figures of the international society, 5 friends of Greece. We will talk today about the future of the Greek economy. Let us follow this conversation, this debate. Welcome. We would like to thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Argyriades PAPASTATHIS. I am a news reporter for the daily newspaper and radio Vima. It is organized by the e-learning of the University of Athens and the independent think tank Deep Analysis. Now, going back to my Greek, I would like to tell you that there couldn't be any better conjecture in order to have this conversation a few hours after the Eurogroup decision, where we all try to understand what that means, we all try to interpret it, and in order to see also what the relation is with our title. I would like to present to you now this extraordinary panel that you have in front of you, who have traveled from all over the world in order to be here with us. You have Mr. Panagiotis Petrakis next to me. You all know him, a professor of the University of Athens, and next to him it's Zsolt Darvas. He is the chief partner of Bruegel Institute in Brussels, and a partner of the Institute of Economics of the Hungarian Scientific Academy. Thank you very much for being here. Next to Mr. Darvas is Mr. Michail Chaliassos. He is a professor at the University of Goethe in Frankfurt for the macroeconomics and finance. He's also the founder and director of CPR. Welcome to Athens. From the other side of the Atlantic, Mr. Harold James, history professor and international affairs of Princeton University. I don't think he needs more introduction. Welcome, Professor. Next to him is Paolo Manasse. Welcome to Athens. He is a professor of macroeconomics and international economic policies in the University of Bologna. Welcome. And next to Mr. Manasse is Mr. Klaus Schrader. He is a senior economist in the Kiel Center of European Policy at the Institute of Global Economy. And, of course, we also have all of you who will attend. We will ask 6 questions in total. The first question will be answered by Mr. Petrakis, and the next 5 questions will be answered by all 5 eminent guests of our event. Let's not waste more time. Let's go to the process. Professor, a few hours after the statement of the Eurogroup, Mr. Petrakis, I would like to tell you to tell me what is your opinion about the impact of the crisis on the Greek economy and the phase where we are right now. The Greek crisis up to now has gone through 4 different phases. The first was the phase of the preparation of the crisis. It was the period up to 2009, and especially from 2001 onwards, where Greece was part of the Eurozone. So then we had low interests, no possibility of readjustment of the exchange rate, and monetary policies that has deregulated all possibilities of an inflow of facilities. The specificity with Greece that was shaped by the public sector and not the private one, as in other economies under crisis. So there was an excess aggregation of resources, especially in the non-trade sectors, and then finally the increase of the salaries and payrolls were exceeded or transcended productivity, so we had a degradation of the unit labor cost. The crisis in the level of activities in the economy was confronted with the perception of the extensive perception of Keynes, and it led to an inflation of public borrowing. So then this crisis at the second phase was manifested as the sudden stop in the beginnings of 2010, and at the same time it's the same reality that was extended in the remaining European countries that led the countries in crisis in the successive introduction of these countries in the assistance financial aid packages by the IMF and the European institutions. This was in order to avoid regular default. The third phase was the phase of the political crisis. This third phase is characterized by a systematic failure of the Greek political scene to ensure a medium-term deal between rescue programs and the domestic public opinion with regard to the reforms required to the social and financial system. However, financial policy followed was also characterized by a series of failures, as, for example, the size of multipliers that led to the false expectations for growth. So economy is in a chronic recession with pessimistic expectations. The fourth and last phases is the one of seeking the growth model, and there we believe that this debate, tonight's debate is going to contribute. The fourth and last phase is composed by the progressive effort to develop a model of internal depreciation based on investment and export. This would replace the consumption model that prevailed up to 2009. So there's an aspiration, there's an expectation behind this change. In this framework, Greece remains a champion of reforms and of financial adjustment all these years, although we hear rumors about the opposite. This is what the indicators show. However, the efficiency of the model was disturbed in 2015, and it was postponed for 2 years. And now, the provisions of the European Commission and of the IMF are speaking of a relatively dynamic recovery in 2017 and 2018, which is based on the fact that export and investments will be increased by 2.5 billion euros annually in order to come back to a medium-term rate of growth of about 1.5%. This can happen only with the new recession waves of austerity. So we need to be very careful about what we expect to happen. Unfortunately, the model based on investment and export fits to economies without any problems of debt reserve, with inflation, with regular inflation pressures, and with an efficient monetary policy. This is not valid in the Greek economy, whereas this is valid, though, with some deviations to most economies of the Eurozone. So the financial management of the country needs more consent towards the European integration so that all the peoples of Europe may participate in it. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον κύριο Πετράκη και πάμε αμέσως στο πρώτο ερώτημα που αφορά...
And now let's move on to the first question to all our speakers. First of all, about the refugee crisis. What are your thoughts about the European developments and the role of Greece in the light of the refugee crisis in Europe? Mr. James has the floor.
So first of all, I would like to say how grateful I am to be here with you and how honored I am to be present on this occasion. I thought over the last terrible 5 or 6 years a lot about the way in which Europe handles crises. And it seems to me that there has been really a deep problem with the traditional way of thinking about crisis in Europe. There was almost a routine that took up a phrase by Jean Monnet that Europe will advance by crisis. And the idea was that every time there's a little crisis, it shows the inadequacy of existing institutions, and so you can move forward and you can build new institutions to deal with the deficits. But the European debt crisis that emerged quite suddenly in 2009 to 2010 was very, very different to previous crises. And it looked to many people, including, I have to say, myself, as really being completely insoluble because of the extent of the debt overhang, the issue that faces you particularly in Greece. How, with this level of debt overhang, can you come back to the vision of growth that I think Professor Petrakis sketched out very convincingly? The debt overhang looks as if it's the really, really big obstacle in the way of a big surge to recovery. And that faced the opposition in the north of Europe, and the feeling that you couldn't really deal with this issue of debt overhang because the absolute credibility of sovereign debt looked as if it was really the building block of Europe. And once you start to renounce the idea that sovereign debt is sacrosanct, all kinds of things might become possible. And so it would undermine the credibility of the whole effort to make European integration. So you can see this is a classical Greek tragedy in which there are two positions, both of which are really right, but which can't be reconciled with each other. And then the other crises emerged, the refugee crisis, but also the security crisis, following the Russian invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, the breakdown of Syria, it's the breakdown of Libya, and it adds, I think, a different dimension to the crisis, because you can see now that there's something that represents a challenge to the whole of Europe, and it happens that some of the crisis countries, in particular Italy and Greece, are on the forefront, on the borders of the European system in terms of dealing with refugees. So it requires clearly a great deal of effort, a coordination on a European scale in order to deal with this. And everybody recognizes, I think, that this is not a crisis that Greece can deal with on its own, not a crisis that Italy can deal with on its own, but demands a European-wide effort. And if you think of the effort that's required, it also pushes, I think, in terms of making other bits of Europeanness. For instance, the refugees have a tremendous health problem. The people who are coming in from Syria and elsewhere have tremendous medical problems. The Greek system, the medical system, is, as you know, under strain after the years of the fiscal crisis in Greece. You can't deal with this kind of crisis. Can you not Europeanize the medical system in a way that you can also think of Europeanizing frontier control, thinking of Europeanizing the registration of new refugees, asylum seekers? And if you say that what you're doing is necessary because of European security requirements, then I think you get a different attitude in Northern Europe. And you don't get the attitude, we're asked to solve a debt problem that we don't really understand the technicalities of, but requires us, the Northern European taxpayers, to make a fiscal sacrifice. Here is a problem with refugees with a security crisis, which is clearly understood and understandable to everybody in Europe, and which requires an answer in a completely new spirit. So that's why I'm a bit optimistic after the accumulation of all these multiple crises.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ τον κύριο James. Θα ήθελα να υποδείξω στους διακεκριμένους ομιλητές ότι υπάρχει...
I'd like to indicate to our speakers that up there, under the lights, there is somebody who can help them, the chronometer. So you have the time which is allocated to you there.
Yes, thank you very much. I also would like to thank Professor Petrakis for inviting me here. I'm always very pleased to come to your country and have a discussion with the thinkers and many people here. So let me start where Harold James has stopped, and in fact I share many of his ideas and views. For me, the biggest lesson from the refugee crisis, the migration crisis, but also from the security crisis, is that we cannot have a common European border without a European institution which is capable of defending and controlling that border. And also we cannot have, internal security in the EU if the national intelligence agencies are purely national. Even in Belgium, where I come from, they are not just one intelligence agency, but there are many, 5 or 6, and even information flow between the different branches of the Belgian intelligence is far from being perfect. I mean, you may know that in March 22nd there was a tragic attack against Brussels, and there were a number of warnings which arrived in Europe, arrived in Belgium, but was not transmitted properly to representative authorities. So I think indeed the biggest lesson from all of this crisis that we are facing is that we can't have, European security and European borders without controlling it jointly. Now, coming back to the macroeconomic situation and outlook. Now, everybody in Brussels and Frankfurt seem to be happy, in a sense that some economic growth is returning. I think this year and also last year, Greece is the only European Union country which suffered from economic contraction. And this is certainly good news and has to be celebrated. But we also has to keep in mind what happened before. And I'm strongly convinced that the recession in the previous 5 or 6 years became deeper than it could have been. And again, for that, there were a number of reasons, macroeconomic reasons, financial reasons, but there are also a number of reasons related to economic governance that I would like to emphasize. Again, Europe faced a common crisis, a very deep crisis. It was clearly the deepest crisis since the Second World War. And the European institutions were simply not up to the job of managing this crisis. But we witnessed many late-night meetings between the European Council, the ECOFIN. Also, I mean, last night the Eurogroup on Greece ended at 2 p.m., even though there was not much surprises. We can discuss that later. But coming back to the crisis, I think this governance system, which is based primarily on late-night meetings and ad hoc discussions and negotiations, I mean, it's not surprising that it's delivering, unfortunately, rather, I mean, unfavorable outcomes that, as we observed in the past years, and not just in Greece. I mean, Greece was clearly a tragedy what happened here, but also in the rest of Europe. And looking forward, yes, I mean, there is some growth, and it may continue. There are also some risk factors, but in order to keep my time, maybe I stop here and pass the floor back. Thank you.
Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και θα ήθελα να δώσω τον λόγο στον κύριο Μανάση.
So, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be in Greece. The first thing I should say, coming from Italy, is that I think both Italians and Greek people have shown a really good example of the meaning of compassion and sympathy to the refugees. I think that should be an example for the rest of Europeans. Having said that, let me say why I don't agree with the optimism that Professor James just shown before concerning the migration crisis, or if you want to call it that way. I am very worried about this crisis, and I think that if there is one thing that could really break up the Eurozone, would rather be this crisis than the debt crisis. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is that well, we have seen how a very small crisis of the order of 2.5% of GDP, that's the amount of Greek public debt, you know, or the Greek economy, say, in the Eurozone. We have seen how such a small shock can kind of bring the Eurozone to the verge of, you know, destruction. And I think that the challenges that we face from immigration, I mean, if things go bad in Syria and in Northern Africa and so on, I think could be much larger as a shock. And so of another order of magnitude. And the other thing that makes me very worried about this refugee crisis is the fact that unlike for monetary affairs, we don't have an institution that can impose a solution to all the countries. So we don't have a Mario Draghi and a ECB that can actually force a solution on recalcitrant countries. And that's a problem. It's a problem of lack of institutions. It is a problem of lack of consensus, and it's even worse than, you know, having to kind of lend money when you have to take people that you don't want. It's much more difficult in terms of the politics of it, because what we are now seeing in many countries. We had the result in Austria just yesterday, and we have, you know, very large and mounting xenophobe parties in many countries, in Greece also, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, in the UK, and in Poland, and so on and so forth. And it would be very, very difficult to force a political solution to governments which risk losing the election if they kind of concede over a kind of a reasonable solution and a division or a division of immigrants across countries. It is true that technically the solution of the refugee crisis is very simple, and some people, for example, have even proposed algorithms that have been developed by an economist, a Nobel Prize, Alvin Roth, to match kidneys and patients needing transplant of kidneys, in the best possible way, as a way to match immigrants and countries, and according to their capacity. But so technically, it is true that it's very simple. Problem, it's very, very difficult and much more difficult than the debt crisis from a political point of view. So on that, I'm not optimistic. Thanks.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον κύριο Μανάσε. Και τώρα ο λόγος στον κύριο Σράντερ.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, for staying in Athens. But I'm a little bit surprised to stay here in 2010 when we start observing the Greek crisis. We would never have been thought that in 2016 there would be a discussion on the Greek crisis. What a surprise, because I think a lot of people underestimated the Greek crisis. They thought it would be perhaps a problem of 1, 2, 3 years, and then the crisis would be over. We looked at Ireland, at Portugal, Spain, and other program countries. They finished their crisis at latest in 2014. But what about Greece? Now it is 2016, and we are talking again about the Greek crisis. Till the summer last year, 2015, Brexit, a serious breakdown in the European Union, and all the headlines, they ruled the media, the public discussions, the policy in Europe. But after the Memorandum of Understanding in August 2015, a lot of people thought crisis is over, actually, and we can focus on the new crisis, on the refugee crisis. And what a surprise, in this refugee crisis, Greece again played a special role. It was a transit country. The other European partners were annoyed that Greece was not capable to handle asylum procedures, to protect the Schengen borders, and they were caught in surprise that the administrative capabilities in Greece were not sufficient. But I think they did not learn from the crisis years before that Greece has serious problems, that they do not have the financial and the personal resources to manage a European problem alone. It is not a Greek problem, this refugee crisis, it's a European problem, and as it was mentioned before, it is a European task. And I think the partners understood, and now financial and personal resources are flowing in, are pouring in to help protect the Schengen border, to manage the refugee crisis, and to prevent, I think, a big danger for Greece. Because in the beginning of the discussion, how to handle the crisis, there was the wording of give the Greek government a discount on reforms, let them postpone the reform process, just that they can allocate some financial and personal resources to the refugee crisis. This discussion is over, and it is good that it is over, because it wouldn't have helped the European partners that Greece would have a new burden with the refugee crisis, and have not yet solved the crisis, the economic crisis that has touched the country the years before. And perhaps this is the good news, that the European partners understand that the Greek economic crisis is not over, that the capabilities of Greece are restricted, and that the refugee crisis as well as the Greek economic crisis are European tasks that has to be solved together. And hopefully now in the year 2016 we are closer to the end of both crises than we were before in 2010. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον κύριο Σράντερ και για την αισιόδοξη οπτική και κλείνουμε αυτή την ενότητα.
For your optimistic point of view, and now Mr. Hayas will speak in Greek. Θα ήθελα, I would like to thank Mr. Petrakis for the initiative, for the conference, the organization of this event, and of course for the invitation. As to the refugee issue, I also have a negative opinion. First of all, we must take into consideration the image of Europe towards the external world as to crisis management. This was an external crisis and a sudden crisis, and the possibilities of Europe, shown by Europe that it is able to handle it, have been tragic. The images of people coming to the Greek islands and being drowned, or people camping on the border with the former Republic of Macedonia in Idomeni, are not images of a European country where somebody wants to invest. Secondly, it has already been mentioned by the other speakers. The second regards the image that Europe has shown to the rest of the world, that is its readiness to share the responsibility in a fair way. What we have seen is that there is no such readiness, such mood. The only mood we have seen is what I can guarantee for myself. This was the behavior of some countries, and when there are I think that the attitude, the behavior of Angela Merkel has been very courageous, especially within the German territory. That is, she opened Germany to the immigrants, and a lot of other countries have reacted to that. Third, Greece has shown a very nice face, nice image. Islanders sacrificed themselves and behaved very well to the immigrants. I think this has been fantastic. I think it is worth giving a Nobel Prize to such efforts. From an economic point of view, from financial point of view, this does not offer us anything. We cannot encourage investors to come here after that. And these immigrants, what must we do with those immigrants? I'm very pessimistic about the positive developments after the agreement with Turkey. I think this agreement will go to wreck, will fail eventually, and there is a great probability that the immigrants stay here. So these immigrants may be a specific group of people. That is, they may be people that try to go to Northern Europe, and may include people with big ideas and abilities, and may also be able to contribute to the Greek economy. Over the past 3 years, 4,000 companies were set up by Syrian refugees in Turkey. This is what I read. However, Greece is not in such a phase in order to take advantage of this opportunity, that is, welcome them and give them a space to develop financially. This is brevity and substance at the same time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chaliassos, and all the speakers for respecting time limits. And let me pass to the next session regarding the third program, adjustment program of Greece, bringing Greece in front of the review. So what is your opinion about the adjustment programs in the European Union? Do you believe that Greece is a special case? Let me now start by Mr. Darvas.
So the question whether Greece is a special case, and I think there is a very easy answer to this question. Yes, Greece is a special case. I will say a few arguments why I think that the case. But also, if you just look, I mean, Klaus Schrader already mentioned that the other countries are already out of the program. So Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Cyprus, they have all left their financial assistance programs. We can discuss, you know, how successful these countries were. I mean, in one sense, they were successful that they could return to market financing. I mean, for example, Ireland can borrow at a really low interest rate. I mean, recently Ireland issued a 100-year maturity bond to the market, which is, I think, really remarkable. But coming back to Greece and answering the question why Greece is a special case, unfortunately there are many reasons which are not favorable to your lovely country, I have to say. Even Mr. Petrakis, in his initial remarks, he described 4 phases of the Greek crisis and described the first one between 2001 and 2009 as a kind of preparation for the crisis, where, I mean, the public sector, I mean, extremely, you know, excessive interference into almost everything. I mean, the share of number of public institutions, the number of public employees increased really dramatically. Wages increased way faster than productivity increases. If you look at any indicators of government efficiency, then again a very sad conclusion about your otherwise wonderful country is that public administration is extremely inefficient. So clearly the starting point was much worse. Let me just also remind you or recall that in 2009, which was the first more serious year of let's say the global crisis. I mean, it started 2007, but most countries suffered in 2009. In 2009, if I recall well, Greek GDP fell by about 2 or 3% or so. So the recession was not that deep, but in that single year, Greece had a budget deficit of more than 15% of GDP. I mean, as an economist, I'm an economist and a macroeconomist. I mean, it's hard to imagine for me that how can a country have a 15% of GDP budget deficit in a single year when the recession is not so deep? So clearly there were irresponsible fiscal policy and a lot of failures, but this has led to the result that the public debt of Greece was very high when the adjustment program started. Again, this is completely different for the other countries. You know, Ireland, the Irish public debt was less than 25%. In 2007, in Spain, public debt was less than 40%. In Portugal and Cyprus, it was a bit over 60%, but still, you know, let's say 65% was less than 1/2 than what Greece had in 2009. So clearly, the starting position was much worse, and this is one major reason why Greece suffered so much. The second major reason is that Greece was the first country in the Eurozone to enter assistance, financial assistance, and thereby your country was unfortunately a kind of experiment. I have to say kind of experiment because it was, you know, unimaginable before that a Eurozone country will need a rescue. And I still record the discussions in early 2010 when, for example, prominent members of the European Central Bank said that no Eurozone country can receive a financial assistance program from the IMF. For example, it was, again, unimaginable at that time. And there were a lot of ad hoc discussions, agreements, and at the end, in May, in a rush, when Greece lost market access, a program was put together in a rush. And the fact it was put in a rush, it also meant that it was not properly designed. And I mentioned two major issues. One is overly optimistic assumptions. Now, at least the IMF has learned this lesson. It has assessed its own previous Greek programs and admitted that this was a mistake. But the problem is that if you have an optimistic, let's say, GDP assumption for let's say after 3 years, Greece was expected to grow, and all the tax revenues to the government was calibrated to this optimistic GDP growth path. So when actual growth became much weaker than planned, then certainly tax revenues were again much weaker. But since official financing was calibrated to a much more positive GDP development, there was no money. So the only solution was, or the result was, that Greece had to do more and more and more fiscal adjustment, and it clearly pushed your country to just a deeper and deeper recession. Another major failure, in my view, was that for too long it was pretended that Greek public debt is sustainable. I think already in 2010 it should have been clear that Greek public debt is not sustainable and something serious will have to be done with that. Yet the debt restructuring was delayed to March and April 2012, so for quite a long period. And during this long period, there was 1 year from, let's say, late 2010 to late 2011, where much better than me, every day there was a discussion whether Greece will leave the euro area or not. And certainly, it's not surprising if there is a risk that a country would leave the euro area, then nobody wants to invest. Everybody inside would like to take their money out. So the outcome can be just, again, a deeper and deeper recession. So I think this was another major reason. And the last one that I mentioned is, again, unfortunately unfavorable to you, is that if you look at any indicator of institutional quality, I already mentioned the government effectiveness, but we can also look at any other indicators. How long does it take to settle a legal dispute, or whatever? How many days it requires for a company to be able to export? How many permissions are needed for certain businesses? Then again, unfortunately, your country ranks very, very badly. There was a lot of improvements, and this makes me optimistic. So to be also able to say a few optimistic words, that in the past couple of years there were a lot of improvements, but clearly the starting position was really, really weak. So for all of these reasons, indeed I conclude that Greece was a special case, and unfortunately continues to be a special case.
Μας κάνατε την καρδιά περιβόλη.
You have delighted us.
Κύριο Μανάσε για το ίδιο θέμα.
Now to the floor to Mr. Manasse for the same topic.
I agree with many things that were said. Clearly, Greece was a special case in many respects. In one word, the problems were much larger than in any other country in Europe. So the solution was more difficult, and then it turned out much more painful than could have been. But the starting point is that one should not just look at what happened since the beginning of the crisis. To get the whole picture, one should look at also the years when Greece joined the common currency. And if we do that, we can see that there was a huge growth in per capita income in this country from 2000 to 2007 that was really financed by debt. So it was really some sort of bubble, an unsustainable growth, and people really thought that they were richer. But if you look at productivity thing, for example, productivity didn't increase as much, so it was really a boom in consumption, in investment that was financed by borrowing, either from abroad with huge imports and current account deficits, or by government borrowing. And the bad things about that is that sooner or later, creditors, come in and say, well, please, pay back what you borrowed. So it was really an unsustainable growth, and people were thinking that they had really become rich, but if you think of the real fundamentals of the economy, that was not true. And so in a sense, it was coming back to reality, although, jumping from the roof of the house where you thought, you could stay and enjoy, the sun. Having said that, it's clear that there were, with the benefit of insight, you can say there were huge mistakes in the adjustment programs, and that was not the responsibility. I mean, what I said so far is the chief responsibility of Greece, but the mistakes were really design mistakes and political mistakes made by the international institution. And one of the first and the largest mistake, I think, has been mentioned, was the fact that when you confront a debt which is, in the order of 170% of GDP, well, it's clear that, a country will not, particularly in a very deep recession, will never ever be able to pay it back. So the only sensible thing would have been to restructure the debt up front and to reduce, to restructure the debt. And having done that at the beginning of the program would have saved a lot of pain and a lot of recessionary policy to this country. So that was not done for ideological reasons, mainly, but it was economically a big mistake. It didn't work, and it made the situation worse. So I think that was, not the responsibility of Greece. There were many other mistakes. Maybe I will comment on that, about this idea of structural reforms that has been becoming some sort of mantra of international institutions. Which is a very delicate thing, and where a lot of mistakes can be done and have been done. In particular, the fact that international institutions forced a very hastily and cruel liberalization of labor markets, but not of product markets, had very bad consequences, namely that prices did not fall because there was not an increase in competition, but wages did. And so, that was not good. I mean, if both wages and prices had fallen together, the consequences would have not been so bad for demand, for the recession, and so on and so forth. But there was a big mistake, I think, in giving a lot of prevalence to labor market reforms rather than to competition and reforms in products and services. So, but that's another story. I'll stop here.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Μανάσε. Ο κύριος Ράντερ έχει το λόγο.
Mr. Radrich, you have the floor.
Yes, I try just to add why Greek is special in my opinion. Well, I think every program country is special, was special. The programs had been tailored to the specific needs of each program country and to, of course, to its special shortcomings. If you look at the success story, how politicians may call them, Ireland and Portugal, you see that even between these two countries, there were obvious differences. Ireland comes from another level. It is the second richest country of the EU after Luxembourg, and it has no structural shortcomings. It has a problem with its financial market sector that expanded too fast in the 2000s. They needed a restructuring of the banking sector. Of course, they also needed fiscal consolidation, but this was, I think, a minor problem in the whole European crisis. It was an easy case, to say it in the words of a policymaker, to make Ireland successful again. You have to see where a country comes from, and Ireland is one of the richest countries. The case is quite different in Portugal. Portugal comes closer to Greece. In Portugal, of course, restructuring of debt, fiscal consolidation, reorganization of the banking sector, and so on. All the same was necessary in Portugal, but additionally, structural reforms regarding the labor market, regarding the production markets, and of course, the missing competition on the production and service markets, they were in the focus of the reformers. This comes close to the agenda Greece has. And if you look at the results of the Irish and the Portuguese programs, you see Ireland is successful. It's growing by rates of 5–8%. It's quite difficult to imagine. While Portugal's recovery comes slower, is slower, modest growth of 1–1.5%. Also in the next year, there won't be biggest surprise with respect to growth, but it might be perhaps model for Greece. But is this true? If you look at the reform agenda of Greece, it is a full-scale reform. Nothing is missing, and the scope, the persistency, and of course the resulting reform agenda is special, is singular in the whole process. But what is the reason for this? In this case, history matters, but history perhaps not the point of history when Greece joined the Eurozone, but when it became member of the European community. There it had problems to develop a functioning market economy and to overcome market distortion. It had problems which now might be help to explain why it is so difficult to carry through structural reforms in Greece. And what I think is the crucial point is missing ownership. Ownership is crucial for a successful reform. If you do not believe in your own reform process, if you do not take responsible for reforms, if you think that this is something strange, this comes from outside, this is not mine, these are not my reforms. Ownership could make the difference. In Portugal and Ireland, at least, ownership was given. The people were not happy with the reform. Of course, they had to sacrifice income, wealth. This make everybody unhappy. But there was a kind of common denominator in policy and society with respect to reforms. And this is special in Greece. This openness towards reforms is missing. This ownership is missing, in my opinion.
Άλλη μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα τοποθέτηση. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Another very important positioning, and now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Chaliasos, who is giving us an insight and a view from the outside. Well, I'd better not combine that. Let me start with the first part of the question, what I feel was the biggest problem of the problem here in Greece, most especially. I think it is exactly what the last thing that Mr. Schrader said, that the program was adapted and presented in a way that Greek people could not just swallow it. You can't go to people and tell them we're going to cut off salaries, we're going to cut off pensions, we're going to lay off civil servants, we're going to increase taxes, we will reduce allowances and benefits, we will reduce public expenditure. Love us. No, you can't. You can't love them. There has to be something that will create some sort of perspective, something that will create some sort of hope, of potential to adapt and to grow. I was impressed all these years by a persistent position of a colleague, Hans Pernezil, who said that the tragedy of the European South is that the former Eastern countries were integrated, that we have cheap labor, and that all salaries have to go down to that level. Otherwise, southern countries won't be able to recover. The answer to that is that Germany has an even bigger problem. It doesn't have to deal with the East Europeans, but China. And China's wages are really so low compared to the Europeans. But the message to German working people is not to compete with China, but provide quality, provide better products, and then your price, your salaries can be justified compared to mass productions. Nobody conveyed such a message here. Another thing, and this is related to the big cuts in salaries when there are no equal cuts in prices. A big problem and a big specificity of Greece is that Greece, contrary to Ireland and to Spain, even Portugal, doesn't have a developed private production sector. I also believe at this point that politicians for many years have played a negative role, since when you develop a state based on clientelism, when you use public money and European funds in order to fund people you know, then you have the following consequences. First of all, you do not encourage productivity, but the growth of clientele relation and political party dependencies. And the second is that you close the circle of productivity and you limit it to those sectors that can be funded by the state. And not people, not demand in general. So even if prices dropped, or as others said, if we left the euro in order to be cheaper, we did not have the possibility to increase production to a degree that would make us richer, that would increase our income. Another specificity, and I think I will take a bit more time here, but I need to say that. Another specificity is the politicians themselves are facing, as they were challenged by the adaptation program. They said they would go through the programs, that they would do it, and then what they did, they put their civil servants, senior civil servants, to try and suggest equivalent measures that they suggested to the Troika, and they were accepted. We went on strike, we started manifesting, we burned some Belgian, some German flags. You have the same colors, so I think it was a mistake. We meant to burn the German flags. So this happened as well. Now, if you remember the course of things, when PASOK tried to go forward with the reforms, half of PASOK and all the rest were against reforms. Then the others came in power. And then little by little, Greek people was educating their politicians so they may all become aware that reforms were good and necessary. So this path continues. And now everybody is aware that we do need reforms. However, when you have this music chair game where some people have chairs and others do not have chairs, those who don't have chairs are the opposition, and they tell the others, why do you do things you blamed us for before? So nobody's convinced that we should go forward by doing things. These are the specificities, these are the problems that have put us at a difficult spot. Thank you very much, Mr. Chaliassos. Professor James, in his interview for Vima on Sunday, stressed the following. He said, you need to stop talking about new austerity measures. And I expect him now to answer to this question.
Many of the points have already been made by the other members of the panel. Greece really is very, very different from the other crisis countries with the programs, with the Troika. And I think the contrast is really that with Ireland and with Spain, there's an enormous real estate boom and a private sector financial bubble. With Portugal, there's a low growth scenario. Portugal in that way looks more comparable to Italy, and Italy, I think, has some big problems coming to it in the future. Greece didn't have the low growth problem. It had a high growth, but it didn't have the private sector bubble. It had, as the other panelists pointed out, a public sector bubble. In that circumstance, it's inevitable that people will make contrafactual cases, what might have been done differently. And there are two of those contrafactual cases, both of which have been mentioned by members of the panel. So Professor Manas rightly said that the enormous debt overhang was a problem and that debt restructuring should have been done earlier. It couldn't have been done, he rightly said, I think, because of ideological reasons. But it's very, very difficult to think of the circumstances in which debt restructuring is done very quickly. And to that extent, the Greek tragedy reminds me of the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, where the crisis broke out in 1982. But it really took 7 years until 1989 before there was the institutional framework in which debt restructuring could really have been done. But that question of debt restructuring is a critical one, because we're used in the world to handle private sector debt restructuring. Corporations fail all the time. We're used to handling sub-sovereign debt restructuring. So cities in the United States frequently go bankrupt. There's a German state, Bremen, which is bankrupt. But it's not so much of a problem to do that when the question is the sub-sovereign debt. But with sovereign debt, it really is a big issue, and I can understand why it's taking so long to grapple with these issues. Ireland had exactly the same kind of issue in the sense that although Ireland didn't have a big debt before the crisis, as a result of the bank guarantee, probably misadvised in the early stages of the financial crisis, certainly I think misadvised in the early stages of the financial crisis, it had an enormous debt, public sector debt, and yet you can see the success story in terms of when credibility returns and when growth returns, it's possible to borrow in today's circumstances on very, very favorable terms. So that's one counterfactual. The other counterfactual is the Greek exit from the currency union, and a lot has been said about this. I don't think it was really a realistic possibility, but in order to see what you can do in those circumstances, maybe the right comparison that you can make is not with the Eurozone program countries, but with an EU country that had an IMF program and had a fixed currency arrangement that was highly contested with Latvia. And Latvia Many people were doubting that this program was sustainable at the beginning, but it turned out to work very well. I think because the Latvian ownership was much, much greater, much more substantial than the ownership was in Greece. So the ownership is really crucial. And it comes then to the issue, what went wrong in this political circumstance? What went wrong, I think, is the idea that Greece was so central to the European financial system that you needn't make any reforms because you could, as it were, extort something by failing to make reforms, that the threat of a Greek exit from the euro was so destructive that it could postpone ad infinitum the possibility of reform. That was a calculation that had some plausibility in 2012. But by 2015, when the European institutions have been reshaped, it isn't the right kind of calculation. And that brinkmanship last year was extremely costly and did a great deal of further damage to the Greek economy. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και πάμε ευθύς αμέσως στην επόμενη ενότητα.
Thank you very much, and let us now move to the next session. So this is the fourth out of the 6 questions, and it is related to the oracle of the Eurogroup about the Greek debt, but it also extends the horizon. What is your opinion about the public debate on the secular stagnation conditions? We could say that this is economic stagnation, and about the conditions of the super cycle of the public debt, of the non-sustainable debt, in the framework of deviating roads of development in Europe, which is the future role played by small economies of Europe, such as Greece. And let us start by Mr. Manas.
Okay, thank you very much. This question sounds, a bit of an academic question to some extent. There are different theories. One is this theory of secular stagnation. One is a kind of theory of debt overhang. So being a professor of economics, it's my job to take in kind of difficult questions and make them even more difficult so that people are completely confused. So, but let me just say a few things in general, and then maybe try to argue that it's not just a purely academic question. There have been a debate between economists about whether the fact that we are observing very low real interest rate is something that we should worry about and something that is here to stay. And this comes together with the fact that many economies, in particular in Europe, are kind of pretty slow in kind of getting out of the recession. The US is doing a little bit better, but not as well as they have in the past, recovering from a previous recession. So there are people who are saying there have been some kind of long-term phenomena which are responsible for both this very, very low real interest rate and low growth. And one is, for example, inequality. The rising inequality in many OECD countries have shifted, resources from the poor to the rich, and the rich consume a smaller fraction of their income, so aggregate demand is going down and saving is going up. Another factor would be the rise in uncertainty after the kind of all the shocks from the, subprime crisis in the US, then the debt crisis in Europe has risen uncertainty, so people have been saving a lot. Other point to the fact that, there are a lot of problems with the banking sectors. Households have constraints in finding funds for consumption, and firms have difficulties in borrowing for investment, and so that is a kind of another forced savings. It increases saving, reduces investment, and the real interest rate suffers. So, and then there are the demographic factors. For example, the fact that people live longer, they have to provide for their lives, so they save more, and the excess of saving kind of depresses the real interest rate, and that's why we are in a situation which a few years ago would have been imaginable, like negative interest rates in many, as a yield to many government bonds, for example. But this explanation is an interesting one, although I think tend to kind of and strikes a number of points. I think it has two problems. One problem is that being some sort of very long run phenomenon, one would have thought that these things would have materialized, much more slowly. But in fact, it seems like all these things have, conjured and all have shown up, immediately. I mean, it's very unlikely that this very long-term phenomenon can change things from, before the crisis and after the crisis. And so I tend to prefer the kind of another explanation, which is more stresses more the role of debt and in fact the effect of the financial crisis. I mean, the financial crisis has been characterized by what economists call deleveraging. I mean, so firms and individuals have incurred too much of debt, and then they have to kind of sell off their assets in order to pay for the debt, and that's in part a downward move to asset prices with a lot of problems. Banks go bust and fail, and the whole thing is transmitted to the real economy. And there are other factors, I think, that are kind of more of a kind of temporary nature. The aggressive monetary policy of central banks, the slowdown in investment in countries like China, and so on and so forth. So why understanding which theory is correct has implication? Well, on one hand, I think that the different approaches to these questions agree on the fact that we are in a mid of a situation in which we have to increase aggregate demand, because we have a shortage of aggregate demand or an excess of saving globally. The point is, where do we go from here, and how do we raise aggregate demand? I don't know, if we agree with the kind of secular stagnation approach, then there is an easy way. So you just increase public expenditures and particularly investment, and that would drive up interest rate and increase aggregate demand. If you agree with the kind of financial crisis type of approach, then it's not that easy, because if one of the problems is that this excessive debt has caused a lot of problems, and public debt in particular has crowded out private debt, then it's not that clear that you just need to kind of issue even more public debt when interest rates are already very, very low. So I think I tend to agree more with the view that says, well, I'm not sure that this situation is here to stay forever. And if we think of a kind of natural consequence of financial crisis, then probably we are a little bit more optimistic on one hand, but on the other hand, it's not that easy to get out of a situation which is, basically has its own reasons in non-performing loans, balance sheets that, have been damaged very seriously in firms, banks, households, and so I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Ο κύριος Schrader έχει το λόγο.
Mr. Schrader has the floor.
Yes, in my opinion, both macroeconomic theories, approaches might explain the world economy, but it's very difficult to explain the Greek situation with these two approaches, with these two theories. In my opinion, the situation in Greece is quite different. There is no automatism for lower growth, for higher growth. It depends on Greece if it finds its growth model, if it finds its business model. These are the prerequisites for higher growth rates, which correspond with a catching up country. Greece is not an old industrialized country like North America, like Germany and so on. Greece is a catching up country with potential if these potential become awakened. And the whole reform process intends to awaken these potentials. And if you look at the new European Commission spring forecast for Greece, published I think 1 week ago, of course they forecast that this year the Greek economy will contract a bit, but next year growth is expected. 2.7% is the forecast, I think, for next year. Not for this year, for next year. As it was 2 years before, when they had a forecast for 2015, where they had a forecast of 2.9%. But what is the problem? The problem are the assumptions. The assumption is that the reform process is successfully concluded, that the reforms are implemented, that trust in Greece economy comes back, and markets and investors find new confidence in the Greek development. But this depends on a business model, and I think it's very optimistic to develop a business model in just 1 year or in 2 years. But what would be the adequate business model for Greece? I would say in most of the countries, industry, manufacturing is the driver of income and wealth and growth, and industry, manufacturing mirrors the productive knowledge of a country. Well, then let's have the question, what about Greece manufacturing, about Greece industry? You see the sector is shrinking. It's below 10% of value added. The European average is about 15%. In Germany, it is even 22% last year. And what about quality? The quality issue that Mr. Haliassos mentioned the question round before. The quality is a further problem because Greece industry is rather raw material, labor intensive. High tech is missing. This means that the value added of industry is rather low, and this also means that the productivity is rather low. And if you look at the service sector, tourism and transportation, it's running well, but these are low income sectors, while business and production related services are not so much developed in Greece. This means Greece has to enhance its total factor productivity, as economists say. They have to find a business model which is sustainable and which fits with the role Greece might play in the future as a catching up economy. And this could mean growth rates of 5, 7, 8%, such like Ireland now has realized during the last 2 years.
Thank you very much. What I understood is that we still have a long way to go. Mr. Haliassos. Mr. Manassa helped us all a great deal because he really explained to us the different terms. And now about debt, the viewpoint is that people believe that they were over-debted, and right now they try to reduce their debts, and this is why they do not consume, they do not spend. This is important. It is ephemeral, and it's going to be overcome. I support the other side of long-term stagnation, for secular stagnation for the European South. but not as much, not the same. When economists try to create theories that explain everything for all the countries, of course, they cannot actually catch all the specificities of all the countries. They make some assumptions and then they illustrate that with examples that are not adapted for all the countries. Now, for Greece, Italy, Portugal, countries that did not have this bubble problem in real estate, exchange, and over-indebted houses and businesses. This other theory of secular stagnation is more useful. I think that the tendency here is for people to save money. This is increased. There are factors that have reduced the trend of investing, and in order to find a balance, the interest rate that could do that, and this is a principle that there's a price to everything. Us economists like to have two curves, and at some point they must intersect. So now the interest rate of the intersection of these curves of supply and demand of capitals is so negative, so low, that no central bank can pursue it and implement it. This is the basic idea. So I believe that in this crisis we had certain factors developed, factors that make people want to save more, and investors be more hesitant in investing. Now, with regard to savings, when you increase the uncertainty of revenues, of income, when you increase the possibility of unemployment, when you show people, as the case of Cyprus, the haircut of deposits, and a big part of what we believed savings without risk, savings at bank, finally are not without a risk. And considering that for 2 or 3 nights, even guaranteed deposits of under 100,000 euros were threatened, and Mr. Dijsselbloem said, for example, for Cyprus and other countries, well, he tried to, anyway, to put everything back together, but this notion of guaranteed, of secured savings, this does not exist anymore. Furthermore, the uncertainty for retirement plans, pension plans, the uncertainty for social security and health care, they should be the systems that will help us when we grow older and when we want to make a good use of our savings. Then, for businesses, the main difficulty of Europe to face a crisis, to face a financial debt crisis, public debt crisis, and the uncertainties about global economy, what happens with China, what happens with the global demand. I am afraid, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that all this is leading us to this inequality, this asymmetry, or to this simultaneous relocation or displacement of these two tendencies. Mr. James.
There are, I think, two things that are driving the discussion about secular stagnation. One is the enormous growth of the world economy and in particular of emerging markets. So there's been a real shift of the geography of the world economy. And it's a story of China, but not just of China. It's a story of enormous growth elsewhere, and the formation of a global middle class, a really very substantial global middle class. And the second element of the global stagnation story is the story of technical change and new technical opportunities. So what does that do to the question that we're addressing in the afternoon in the panel? What does it do to the prospects for public sectors, for public sector debt? It means that the interest rate environment is likely for a very substantial period of time to be very, very low as the search for secure investments is driving more and more into every nook and cranny of the world economy. And so countries and systems that can make credible commitments are going to be able to borrow very, very cheaply. But on the other hand, where those credible commitments are not being made, you will see sudden spikes in interest rates and sudden stops in credit flows and enormous political uncertainties. If you want to see an example of this at the moment, if you don't just think of European examples, you can look at Brazil. That's exactly what's driving the financial, economic and political crisis in Brazil today. So countries that can't make credible commitments are going to find it impossible to have well-functioning public services. And this is something that you can see, I think, the fear of in any country where there's a high level of debt. It's there in Japan, it's there in the United Kingdom. One of the elements of fear in the Brexit discussion is what will happen to public debt if there's a negative vote on the 23rd of June. But it pushes us back, I think, when you want to think in these terms, to thinking about the general framework of the European system and of European debt, because both the net debt levels and the net deficit levels in the Eurozone, if you add them all together, are lower than they are in the United States or in the United Kingdom, and much, much lower than they are in Japan. And if you just take that as an indication of what could be done, it does seem to me to hold out the path that a European cooperation and a European level of fiscal integration that you don't have at the moment has a possibility of offering genuine improvements in public service that will create the framework in which greater economic growth, more dynamism is possible. Just one word on the manufacturing story. Is it necessary for every country to do manufacturing? I think that would be a chimera in today's world. If you think that you can really compete with East Asia, that's not going to be the way of the future. It's not the way of Ireland, for instance. It's not the way of the UK. But you can think of many specialities, and in particular, making yourself an attractive center for intellectual capital, for intellectual enterprise, is something that I believe holds a great opportunity in this new framework.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, κύριε καθηγητά, και κλείνουμε αυτή την ενότητα με τον κύριο Darvas.
Close with Mr. Darvas.
Lot has been said by now. I think Paolo Menes very nicely summarized the debate on which are the factors which are driving up savings and may influence negatively investments. And there is one factor which was just briefly mentioned by Harold James that I would like to discuss a little bit is technological change and productivity growth, or in fact productivity slowdown. Because if you look at any of the major economies in the world, I mean, what we see is a major slowdown in the rate of total factor productivity. I mean, in the US, it practically halved. So, I mean, the measures which I see show that the contribution of TFE to growth was somewhat over 1% in the decade before the crisis, and in most recent years, it's about half of it. But in Europe, the slowdown was even more significant. So, sorry, for the US, it was about 2, and then it went down to 1. In Europe, it was a bit more than 1, and it went to close to 0. Now, the big question, whether this is just a statistical artifact that we cannot measure well productivity, because the way we measure is that we take into account other factors like labor and capital input, and what remains is thought to be productivity. So if we have a long period of very weak demand, and that very weak demand has certainly, I mean, a negative impact on the total GDP growth, then also, I mean, productivity growth may be the estimates for productivity growth may be biased downward. So one possibility is that we don't measure it properly, but I don't think that this is the major reason, and indeed I think that there is a slowdown in productivity, and that also can be really a major factor behind low and weak investment. I mean, if a company sees, good prospect for productivity increase, then it will probably assume that even if demand is weak, it can get a larger market share, and that company will certainly start to invest. But we can't really see it, and I have to say this is really a puzzle. I mean, the slow productivity growth, because we have an IT revolution, a huge digital revolution, and robotization, and many new technological developments. So I think it's a big puzzle why productivity growth has slowed down. On investment, I can't resist to talk a bit about Germany and about the large German current account surplus, because that's also a manifestation of investment. I mean, some people see the very large German current account surplus basically for two explanations are typically given. One is that Germany is super productive and thereby investing a lot, exporting a lot to the rest of the world. There's a major demand for German goods. Another explanation is that the German society has a really adverse democratic outlook. I mean, one of the fastest aging society in the world, and therefore people have to save more and more for their old days. And certainly all of these explanations are useful and important. I mean, I also assessed the magnitude of the German current account surplus, and indeed some increase in surplus would have been justified, but clearly I think the magnitude of the surplus is really, really large and really excessive. And the current account is the difference between savings and investments, so it means that investments are too low. And again, when I rely on the reports of some German research institutes, they all tend to report that there will be major investment needs in Germany, particularly in the public sector. I mean, also when I drive there in my car, I see on a lot of highways there are speed limits on the roads because of their quality. I mean, public schools would need major upgrades. So I think there will be a lot of need for investment, for public investment, for more demand, and unfortunately it's not coming. And I think this is also a reason that since Germany is the largest economy in Europe, if Germany is not doing well, then it also has an impact on the rest of the European Union.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Δεν ξέρω τι θα γίνει.
I would like to thank you. I don't know what will happen with the restructuring of the debt now, but with the permission of the organizers, we decided to restructure our program a little bit. We thought that many of you are standing, and I can tell you now that I see 3 seats that are free here if somebody wants to come and sit there. So we thought of going to the last question right away so that we may save some time for your Q&A session and your observations. The question is going to be quite generic. I know that our speakers are prepared for more. so they can include some of their thoughts about the previous question as well. So the question is, when and how do you believe that we will be able to live in Greece the end of the era of the memoranda, the end of this Greek tragedy we're living in since fall of 2009? And I would like to give the floor first to Professor Harold James.
Thank you. I think the question of when you're going to break out of the bad dynamic that has been referred to quite often this evening. Klaus Schrader referred to these forecasts that are always promising growth at some point in the future, but don't really seem very optimistic about the present. That's clearly the burning issue. And I think you need to think about this in terms of the question of what is happening in a society that's in a deep crisis in the middle of Europe and in the middle of a global economy that's having its problems. So it's in a way, your reactions to this are a reaction to a crisis of European integration and a crisis of globalization. And often you find the two really associated in discussion. So when people are complaining about the effects of globalization, we've had it before in the discussion, they're thinking about the effects of workers in Eastern Europe, but they're also thinking about the effects of the developments in emerging markets. And what happens in this world is that everything seems to move. So there are goods that are moving, but there's also labor that's moving and capital that's moving. And the labor movement is, I think, one really crucial issue that hasn't been discussed very much this evening and should be at the center of the discussion. Because what a deep crisis will do is it will disillusion younger people and make them move somewhere else. So Northern Europe is full of young Italians and young Spaniards and young Greeks who are looking for better opportunities. And when they're doing that, they're not paying in Southern Europe, in Spain or in Italy or in Greece. They're not paying the taxes that will be needed in order to both educate young people for the future and pay for the retirement of older people. So you've got a violation of a really fundamental generational contract. And there are really two solutions to this, it seems to me. And this is the fundamental question that I think you're facing. There are two solutions to this. One is to stop people moving altogether. And there are many people in many political parties, mostly on the extremes, on the extreme right or on the extreme left, that make this as a serious suggestion to stop the movement of people. And the other solution is to think about the circumstances in which you create the right incentives for people to return and to bring back skills and ideas that they've had somewhere else. And so I think if you want to be optimistic, you need to look at European societies in which this has been the case. So two dramatic failures in terms of massive emigration of young people and the feeling of complete hopelessness and desolation were Eastern Europe or Poland, I know specifically as an example of this with big emigration in the 1980s, and Ireland, which we're thinking of now as a success story. But in the 1980s, it was far from being a success. And there was a famous picture of the graduating class of University College Dublin, where it was pointed out that 2 years later, not a single member of that class was working in Ireland. They'd all emigrated. And what happens in the 1990s is that both in Ireland and in Poland, the institutions were created in which it became really attractive for young Irish people and young Poles to come back. there's something of this happening, I think, in some East European countries today, but not in Romania, not in Bulgaria, not in Macedonia, not in Serbia, and also not in much of Southern Europe. So there's an enormous need for the institutional reform that will make that kind of reverse flow attractive. And only when you do that will you be able to really restore the generational contract, which is absolutely crucial to the success of the future of anywhere. And you can really see places where that hasn't worked. You know, so if the success stories would be Poland or Ireland, the failure story would be the Mezzogiorno of Italy, where these outflows have been going on for a very, very long time, and the result has been a sort of despondency. So the question about when you can get out of the mindset of the memoranda is really a question of when you can fix the fundamental institutions. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Θα ήθελα να δώσω το λόγο τώρα στον κύριο Μανάση.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Manasse has the floor.
Yeah, I agree with many things that were said by Professor James, and here, I mean, it's not easy to give an answer to such a question. I have two remarks. One is about two questions, I mean, really, on which I don't really have an answer. And the first is, what can, technological progress do to the Greek economy? There were theory in the past that economies popularizing in the 60s, in which they were talking about the possibility of technical progress to kind of give huge advantage to developing countries. The name was leapfrogging. So kind of the idea was that there were new technologies, so poorer countries were able to kind of jump steps ahead and not have to undergo all the process that actual richer economies have done, and just to jump to the new technological innovation and to make progress after that, even without kind of very, very solid infrastructures. Now, I always liked this idea, like having, computers and, bringing out a lot of possibilities, even without, hard universities or schools, just because you connect to the internet and you learn from the best people around. But I've become a little bit more skeptical about this kind of magic of technology. And going back to this debate that we were discussing before about whether we are in for low growth for a long period and so on and so forth, there were some remarks made by, for example, Larry Summers, which is one of the proponents of the secular stagnation theory about technology, which kind of struck me as kind of interesting. And the question is, what did technology like, for example, Airbnb do to the constructions of new hotels? Or what did technology like Amazon or eBay do to bookshops? And so the idea is that there is a lot of distractions that comes together with technology, and you may have kind of short-term negative consequences and displacements from new technologies, as well as long-run opportunities, as it's not clear which one is going to prevail and at which time the good incentives are going to kick in and kind of boost, say, the rate of growth of an economy. So this is I'm trying to understand what could be the role of Greece in this very fast-moving world in which these new technologies really change the way in which we are used to behave. I mean, the difference between the consumers and the suppliers are kind of blurred, because now everybody, has maybe an extra room, and it goes into Airbnb and transforms itself into kind of a small hotel, and so all these standard distinctions are being blurred, and it's not clear, whether that will hurt some sectors and will benefit others, and what would be the balance between the two. And another issue that has been discussed is the issue of labor mobility. I think that's an important one. The example of Ireland, maybe it's a particular one, because to some extent Ireland is a sort of part of the UK in terms of the labor market. If you look at what happens in Ireland when Ireland's in a recession, typically people move to the UK, and then when Ireland goes back to growth, then people comes back. So, but I think the issue of mobility is very important, and coming from countries which has a long tradition of emigration, and which had stopped for many years, and now it has come back. I think that's an important thing. Now, from a welfare point of view, I mean, from a theoretical point of view, I mean, one should really care about, the welfare of individuals. So if some Italians go abroad and have a better life, so, that's a good thing for them, for sure. The question is, how does that impact the welfare of those who stay, because maybe they have lesser opportunities? And in that respect, I think there are not many solutions to kind of reconcile the possibly opposite interest of those who emigrate and those who stay. The only solution that I see is a more active role for European institutions. I mean, if you think of one of the few examples that seems to work in that respect is studies exchanges, Erasmus type of things, in which students go abroad, have experience, and then come back. I mean, some sort of, a larger kind of mechanism of that nature to facilitate people from going and trying to provide incentive for their return. I think it could be done possibly only at the level of the EU institutions. It's very hard. I mean, I think from a university point of view, it's very hard to give incentives to a very brilliant students to reject an offer from a leading American university, because you'll never be able to match that offer and convince him to stay unless there is, some aid from, kind of more important institutions. But I'll stop here.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Και θέλω να παρακαλέσω τον κύριο Darvas.
And now, Mr. Darvas.
Yeah, I similarly agree to many of the interesting points that the previous two colleagues have said. I would like to come back to the issue of leaving the memoranda of understanding, because first Greece will have to leave it, and I have to say that I think it's very unlikely that this will happen in 2018. And let me tell you why. I mean, the current plan, according to the statement of the Eurogroup made yesterday, is that, I mean, Greece will do all the reforms, will do the new fiscal adjustment, will receive some form of support for that, such as some longer maturities, maybe some interest rate payment deferrals, and so on and so on. And then by the end of the program in 2017, 2018, a new debt sustainability analysis will be done, made by the institutions, and based on that, they will decide what to do. But I think it's very unlikely that in 2018 Greece will be able to return to market borrowing. And I think the reason is very simple. Currently, Greek public debt as a share of GDP is close to 180% of GDP. Now, if the forecast which was mentioned by our colleagues that the next year will be nicer and nicer, and indeed next years will be nicer and growth will return, still, even in that case, the public debt will be well above 170% of GDP. And, I can't imagine that whatever sub-form of debt relief the country will get, a return to the market will be possible. Look at the example of Portugal, for example. Portuguese public debt is around 130. It can borrow at a rate of about 3% on the 10-year maturity. And Portugal is in a much better situation than Greece. I already mentioned that that is lower. Export of Portugal is growing quite fast. Many reforms have been implemented. Many assessments, including from credit rating agencies, are more positive about the country. So Portugal is clearly in a much better situation now than in Greece will be in 2 years from now. So if Portugal could borrow at a 3%, then Greece will not be able to borrow at a rate below 5, but even 5, I would not bet that a 5% borrowing rate would be possible. But even a 5% borrowing rate would be too high for Greece to sustain. I mean, that I think simply is not sustainable. So I think I would see two options in 2018. One, which is the most likely, that the third program will be followed by a fourth program, parallel to some, again, soft form of help, like extended maturities, longer grace period, and so on. Or at that time, there will come a really sizable debt restructuring, for which I don't really see the political support in many member states. So therefore, my fear is that the end of memoranda is still very far. It's still quite likely that the current third program will be followed by a fourth program. Who knows till when? And unfortunately, all of this mindset which are related to this adjustment program will stay with your country for many years to come.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ο κύριος Schrader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schrader. Has the intervention before the last of the last session?
Well, what will the future bring for Greece? Fourth program, successful third program. I think it's a difficult question to answer, but with respect to the debt issue, I would agree with Zsolt Darvas. But perhaps it also depends on the outcome of the German general elections in 2017, if a solution comes closer to this problem, and perhaps a final solution might be found. Not before 2017, but perhaps a year later, the resistance coming from Germany will fade away, perhaps, hopefully. But I think there is another problem with the Memorandum of Understanding of 2015. It appears to be a relaunch of structural reforms. It appears to be a kind of déjà vu. It means all well-known reforms had been gathered together in this Memorandum of Understanding. Some of my colleagues were caught in surprise that all these problems had not been solved during the last two programs. Well, but this again underestimates the administrative capabilities, the management capabilities of Greece, of the Greece policy, and it underestimates the question of ownership. It's the decisive, the crucial question, I think, if the Greece policy, the Greek society accept having ownership for the whole reform process. And if you look at the administrative capabilities, Greece has to accept some more than technical support, some more than good advice, perhaps even outsourcing of reform projects, because the own management capacities are not sufficient to solve the problem and to fulfill this reform agenda. But this is, of course, a very difficult question. Who likes to lose sovereignty? Perhaps the answer is being part of Europe, being part of the European integration process means a loss of sovereignty for all partner countries. Also for Germany, for Finland, for Austria, all these countries, they will lose sovereignty. And in the case of Greece, they have to support a partner and to give them the management skills. They have the personal and financial resources. This would be not a loss of sovereignty, this would be partnership. Well, if this works this way, perhaps the conditions for doing business in Greece will improve, that Greece will climb up in all international rankings by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the World Economic Forum. But what does it mean afterwards? This means that it would be interesting to invest in Greece, that private investors are confident to make good deals, good business in Greece. This could mean that Greece develops a new growth model, perhaps export-led, export-based growth model. But now this is the question, in which areas will Greece have competitive advantages? Is it just manufacturing? Of course, this could be doubtful. Professor James mentioned specialities, to develop specialities. And this is a good advice, because if you focus on labor-intensive products, on raw material products, you will be in competition with Asian countries, with Latin America countries. This is not a future growth model for Greece. This would mean wage competition with Asian countries. This is not imaginable, and it would mean a race to the bottom. Greece cannot win. This means it has to develop specialities, niches, and has to develop by the help of investment, by the help of investors, to get integrated into global value-added change, where Greek locations of productions could contribute high value-added items, high value-added products to the world economy. And this would also mean higher income, higher wages. This would mean growth. Race to the bottom, this would be the opposite model. Greece could never win, and so perhaps trust in the reforms, trust in your European partners, and develop an export-based growth model, which might bring a brighter future to Greece. Hopefully it will do, and hopefully we will not meet together in 3 years and discuss the fourth program. I do not hope so. Thank you very much.
Και εμείς ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ο κύριος Χαλιάσος κλείνει την ενότητα.
Οι συνάδελφοι θα με συγχωρήσουν αν αποκαλύψω μια...
Let me speak about a discussion we had before starting this discussion today. All colleagues asked me, what do you mean by this question? So they all asked me. So what is the issue here? The issue is that in Greece, mainly politicians, but also people in general, citizens, have taken this memorandum of understanding. What is what? The terms of getting a loan. We have, when you receive a loan, you borrow money, then you have to sign some papers, and this is what we have done here. Politicians speak about anti-memorandum in Greece. Politicians, what is that? And how long does a memorandum last? The memorandum lasts as long as the loan lasts. So if we take a loan up to 2080, then the memorandum will last up to 2080. What will change is what we see in the news. Before, we used to see the three persons of the Troika on TV. Now we don't see them anymore. We see our ministers enter Hilton Hotel. The next picture would be not to see anyone, because everything will become automatically cutting machine, some new pictures, some new terms will emerge. But in essence, when they lend you, they must follow, monitor your progress and your possibility to pay back the debt. So how are we going to pay back the debt? There are two or better three ways to do that. We have this a famous primary debt, which is expenses minus tax coefficients and what is taxed. So we will cut expenses. How much? And we will increase tax coefficients. How much will that? How much will that be? And we must increase productivity. And if we do that, and our colleagues spoke about that, we must find ways to produce more. How can there be a financial solution to the problem that is buy back the loans, etc.? We can't do that. There may be a facilitation, for example, a decrease in the interest rates. However, if we don't have any productivity, we cannot do that. Of course, the colleagues were asked, what can Greece produce? Greece can produce a lot of things. We have our agricultural products. We have foodstuffs and the foodstuffs industry. We have energy. We have different kinds of energy production, both power generation, but also transport of power. And we also have the pharmaceutical industry, especially with genetics, biotechnology, which has a lot of staff, personnel, because Greek parents push their children to be educated, and Greek children have a lot of qualifications. And there are sectors in the electronics industry, and there is a new commerce chamber, the new chamber of people creating software for mobile phones. So it is incredible, isn't it? Why should Greece do that? But we have this scientific potential, and why shouldn't we do that then if we have it? And if you look at the charts, and if you look at the percentages of engineers existing in Greece and mathematical scientists, based on the expenses made for research and development, all countries are on a line. We are outside the line, beyond the line. We have a huge number of engineers, of mathematical scientists compared to what we have. And this means that we shouldn't have educated them, or does that mean that we don't use them? I believe that the second is true. And what the colleague said about immigration, let me share with you my experience. I traveled from Frankfurt to Brussels yesterday, Lufthansa, Frankfurt, Brussels. I gave my passport. The hostess of Lufthansa spoke in Greek. And then I got into the aeroplane. I went to the Brussels hotel, give my passport, and the receptionist speaks in Greek again. And then I go to the European Commission building, Charlemagne. where a lady was standing there controlling, and she looked at my passport, spoke to me in Greek. So this is home, isn't it? And it is full of it. Where are we going? We are speaking about the movement of people, of labor. Very nice, but it is nice when it goes like this, not upwards, because this is lack of lack of the labor force of the southern countries. Is it possible that Greece does not have any developed private or public universities if the state is not able to finance them, is not able to monitor private universities? Why not? The UK has huge income from the development of higher education. Why can't we do that? It is raining there every day. What is our problem? Why can't we develop our universities here in Greece? But we are dealing all the time with memorandum starting, finishing, and we don't think about what Americans say, where is the beef? It is like searching, having your soup in front of you and looking for it. Where is the beef? Where is the substance of what we are doing? And the substance is what we produce. So please, tell our politicians, press them, for them to tell us what their growth program is for Greece, and all the rest, what someone said, what someone else said, this is not important.
Θέλω να σας ευχαριστήσω όλους στο πάνελ.
To thank you all at the panel for the excellent cooperation. I would like to tell you that we have time for 3, maximum 4 questions. I would like to ask the speakers to only take 2 to 3 minutes to answer instead of 4. Anyone who would like may answer the question asked by the audience. Our dear colleague, Mr. Grigoris Giovaras, please ask the first question. Good afternoon. My question is about your estimation about the potential risk of the current program for Greek economy, and most especially if you believe that the biggest risk is the structure of the program and the asymmetrical character between raising taxes and cutting expenditure, or if you suggest the political risk involved with regard to the decision-making and ability to implement what was agreed between the country and its lenders. Thank you. Who would like to answer to this question? Mr. Manas, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think both. The answer would be both. Both risk. I think on one hand, I think it's clear that probably the largest problem in terms of how you should go about kind of improving your budget deficit. I think it's clear that you should go and broaden your tax base. I mean, if you look at statistics about tax compliances or the number of, say, wage earners or pensioners, we are below the threshold under which you don't pay taxes. That's way above anything that is comparable. I read some numbers from the IMF reports. It's something like almost 50% of pensioners and wage earners which are below the threshold such that they don't have to pay taxes. So And then we know, I mean, I come from Italy, so we have a lot of experience about that tax evasion, tax elusion, but I think Greece really stands out as a country in which even in recent years, the tax base have been kind of shrinking, and the only way is really to enlarge it. How can you do it? Well, it's not that difficult. One way you can do, for example, we did, and I'm not sure whether this measure has been undertaken in Greece, is for example, to give the tax authorities all the information about bank accounts. So we did that reform recently, so you don't need a judge to have an inquiry to get into everybody or some people's bank accounts. You have, by default, this information is passed to the tax authority, so it becomes pretty easy. I mean, if you can to design an algorithm such that if your bank account is pretty big, and it turned out that you don't pay any taxes, and I mean, that stands out immediately. And so technically, it's very easy now to fight tax evasion. It's a political decision. And also, the other problem, and I'll try to be short, what has been referred to. Whether the country owns the programs, this ownership of the reforms, and the political risk is clearly that if you have a government which is very ideologically contrary to the reforms, is not surprising that the reforms are not, implemented in a convincing way. So it's both things, I think.
Μήπως κάποιος ακόμη θα ήθελε να κάνει ένα πολύ σύντομο σχόλιο.
Somebody else who would like to make a comment on the same question? Some very, very quick comment, Mr. Darvas.
Well, I share, again, a lot Paolo Manes's assessment, and in particular the issue of the tax base. And I would not, just consider those people who are below the threshold, but many people who have large wealth held to some extent outside Greece, who avoided paying taxes. I mean, that should be clearly the focus of, I think, of tax collection. And if the tax base is broadened, tax rates can be lower, and still the excess revenue can be used for various issues. For example, I think one of the biggest weakness of Greek public administration is the social safety net, the social security. Unemployed people hardly get any money, and just for a few months, even after some time, they even lose their access to healthcare and so on. So I think broadening the tax base, taxing the rich, and using the proceeds to improve a lot the efficiency of the social safety net system, I think that should be the way to go.
Professor James?
So I think in terms of this issue of tax compliance, you're going to have more and more of a debate, and indeed there was something of this last year, of whether you actually should really continue in the long run with physical money. So if you think about the discussion, it's a long discussion now about the 500 euro note. In the 1990s, when the European single currency was being set up, my then colleague in Princeton, Ken Rogoff, was sent by the US Treasury to Europe to say that the 500 euro note was a bad idea. There's just been an agreement from the ECB Council to get rid of the 500 euro note. But I think, you may really be in the future in a world in which you will have small coins for really trivial transactions, but otherwise you will just make payments by electronically traceable credit cards or other instruments, and that this was something. I mean, it was raised in the context of the question of what happens if Greece would leave the euro, and one of the suggestions was exactly to move to purely electronic currency.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Έχω δει τον κύριο με το... Είναι ο κύριος Σάντο, ο οποίος... έχει ζητήσει ήδη την ερώτηση.
There is a gentleman that has asked to ask a question because he participates in the e-learning program of the university. So the question is, do you think that the connection of public organizations is necessary for the assessment of the top executives and according to the international qualifications requirements, IPMA, for example, or is assessment a myth for Greece?
Κύριος Χαλιάς.
Να πω ότι ένα βασικό, και το ανέφεραν όλοι οι συνάδελφοι εδώ, ένα βασικό πρόβλημα...
Very important problem for the development of the productive sector is the state, that is bad public administration. Unfortunately, public administration has been used for years, for decades, as the way the parties had to create a clientele and get votes. So when you put a person in the public administration expecting to get a vote from that person, and you don't need to pay that person very much, because you remember that public employees had very low salaries in the past, and it was very convenient to employ more people and pay them less, and you were not interested in monitoring their work because they were there to vote the government, the party, and if everybody pays, then nobody pays. So what we need here, lenient and mean, that is a thin and bad mean administration, which is able to facilitate the citizen and the development of productive activity. You don't need many people to do that, but you need to have a structure where younger people are assessed by the elderly, by the senior employees, and that you have the same incentives. That is, the senior employees are assessed according to the productivity of those lying under them. So if this is done, then there is a personal interest. It is in the personal interest of the seniors to choose better people in the business, in the administration. This is a necessary prerequisite for the development of the productive activity. Is there any other comments from the panel? So it is 8:30, and we can receive one more question. So the gentleman raised the hand.
So I will ask the question mainly to my professor, Mr. Petrakis. Correcting the weaknesses is the beginning of a solution to the problem. So which are the weaknesses that could be remedied, that need to be remedied in order to trigger growth?
Ευχαριστώ για την ερώτηση, αλλά η απάντησή μου πρέπει να είναι πολύ σύντομη, φαντάζομαι.
The answer has to be really brief. We should face reality as is. We should learn to speak the language of truth between us. We should speak the truth amongst us and the politicians with us. We should become aware of the world that is changing. And we should get more faith from the fact that for 6 to 7 years now we've suffered a lot, but we resist, we still resist. Those of you saying that the journalists are not reliable, well, here's the confirmation. There's one more question that we will receive. The lady in blue, to the panel.
Είναι ανοιχτό. Ωραία. Καταρχήν θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω για ότι μου δίνετε το λόγο. Όλοι οι συμμετέχοντες ήταν εξαιρετικοί.
I have to say that all the speakers were brilliant. One question only. My question is the following. You spoke about growth, development, and the different solutions. Greece is not only a country that can offer development, growth opportunities. You spoke about the energy sector. Technological solutions could promote economy. However, because I have studied world economics, I would like to ask the following question. Could you please also give us more specific solutions apart from those you talked about? Because about what? Because I have remained with questions. Solutions to what? Solutions to growth. I think that this is very difficult. I would like a bold speaker among you in the panel. Is there any candidate that can answer this question?
Τότε θα αναγκαστεί ο κύριος Πετράκης να συνοψίσει και να κλείσει την απόψινή βραδιά, λαμβάνοντας υπόψη του και αυτό το ερώτημα. Εγώ σας ευχαριστώ.
We'll try to summarize today's event, taking into consideration your question as well. So what can I say? I think that the presentations made by our colleagues have created concern. I think we are more concerned. We will leave this room more concerned than before. This is the international picture. This is reality, which is also illustrated in our new book. And because of this book, we are found here today. 32 colleagues around the world are writing about it. And I think that we are now entering a period with better conditions somehow, because the bad things belong to the past, but we are more skeptical. And I wish we don't have to gather again with the same topic, but with a solution to a growth model that we will be able to propose. Thank you very much for being here.